Welcome back to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cressey, and this is episode 207. Today's guest is one of our pitching coaches at Cressey Sports Performance, Florida. He's a guy who takes the lead with not just throwing programs and day-to-day coaching, but also does a lot with our markerless biomechanics setup. Has pulled from a really good data set of pro guys that we've developed over the course of time and been able to apply a lot of it to some of our amateur athletes so we can borrow bits and pieces of how elite throwers sequence and really carry it over to younger athletes who may be trying to find the right mix. What I really like about this episode is it makes you reconsider just throwing an aggressive throwing program at every single kid that wants to gain velocity. In reality, there's often some low-hanging fruit that you can pick from a purely sequencing standpoint to help them put themselves in better positions to not just throw the baseball hard, but do so with a more durable approach and something that's much more repeatable for the sake of command and optimizing pitch movement. So really enjoyed this conversation with him. He's a guy I work with day to day, but putting it in kind of this format and getting to, basically just give him the floor after I ask some questions. I've learned some new things that, we hadn't just uncovered in our day-to-day conversations. So I think you are going to really enjoy it. We also talk a lot about our college summer program where he's really involved. It's a very comprehensive approach to developing pitchers. So definitely check that out, and the links in the show notes. This episode is brought to you by AG1, the most comprehensive NSF certified for sport daily nutritional supplement I've ever tried. With so many stressors in life, it can be difficult to maintain effective nutritional habits and give our bodies the nutrients they need to thrive. As a father of 3 young kids and a co-founder of multiple businesses in multiple states on top of still being an avid exerciser, I know that busy schedules can really take their toll on us. Whether it's poor sleep, exercise or life stressors, environmental factors, or simply not eating enough of the right foods, we can often wind up deficient nutritionally. This is where AG1 can really help. It's a game-changing nutritional insurance policy. They simplify the logistics of getting optimal nutrition on a daily basis by giving you just one thing with all the best things. That's why I use it daily, as do several of my family members, and we recommend it to a lot of our top athletes. One scoop of AG1 contains 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients that work together to fill the nutritional gaps in your diet to support energy, focus, digestion, and recovery. And this can all happen for less than $3 per day and without taking multiple products. While most nutritional supplements come to market and stay stagnant, AG1 continues to obsessively improve this one holistic formula based on the latest research, producing over 50 improvements in the last decade alone. They invest in the most absorbable and natural source of each ingredient and go above and beyond in third-party testing to ensure their customers continue to receive the highest quality and best tasting nutrition happen on the planet. Whether you're keto, paleo, vegan, dairy-free, or gluten-free, it'll work for you, and it contains less than 1 gram of sugar per serving. They put 75 ingredients through the rigorous NSF certification test to come up with a safe formula that's trusted by some of the world's top athletes, including many of our own at Cressey Sports Performance. Right now, AG1 is giving our listeners a special offer of 10 free travel packets with their first purchase. Just head to drinkag1.com/Cressey and claim this special offer. These travel packets are perfect for supporting your immune system, energy, and gut health while you're traveling for games, training, or simply on the go. They can be great counterbalance to the less than ideal on-the-road food options that are out there for a lot of our traveling baseball players. So if you want to bridge the gap between deficient and optimal and give yourself the best chance of getting nutrient diversity, head to drinkag1.com/Cressey to get 10 free travel packets with your first purchase. Again, that's drinkag1.com/Cressey, Cressey. You won't regret it. Today's guest serves as Director of Pitching at Cressey Sports Performance, Florida, and previously held the title of Director of Baseball Operations at our facility. He was an athlete at CSP during his college pitching career at Rhodes College in Memphis, and then he finished up with a graduate year at Seattle University, where he received an MBA with a sports management focus. After the conclusion of his playing career, he worked for the Chicago White Sox, helping run their youth baseball camps. He joined CSP for its first class of pitching interns prior to being hired. He loves the analytical aspect of the game and how it can be incorporated into the development of our athletes. Please welcome to the show, NatheMirochnick. Nate, thank you for taking the time. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
It always feels weird welcoming someone who's like 2 office doors down from me for most of our working life. But I'm in Tampa. You're on the east coast of Florida right now. So I guess technically you are a remote guest for tonight.
Fair enough.
All right. So we're going to talk motion capture, biomechanics. You have probably sifted through just about as much data on this as anybody in the baseball world over the last several years. I think at times we've fallen flat on our face and learned from it. Other times we've had some pretty cool aha moments, but hopefully it makes for a really good discussion. So, maybe the first place to start is like talk about your journey with motion capture, what systems you've been exposed to, and what like the learning curve has looked like for you.
Yeah, so I didn't have a ton of experience with motion capture before I got here, but was fortunate enough to learn under some great people before me. They did an awesome job on the front end with data collection, everything like that. They got, you know, dozens and dozens of our professional guys on there, which made things on the back end a lot easier. So really was able to kind of take the lead on it about a year and a half ago. Really start building out models that we've created once we got a really good data collection. And just going from there, it's given us an awesome idea on development, on new things we can test, both in the gym and from a throwing perspective. And it's been unbelievable for the development of our athletes.
I think you just hinted at something without saying it directly is you have to get a lot of data for two reasons. One, I think, and we'll talk about this, people like to look at averages and it's hard to really get a true, mean or median. And if you only have 8 people in your data set, like you've got to collect a lot of data. But I think just as importantly, the larger your data set, the more you can embrace the outliers. You can see the weird stuff that doesn't make sense that teaches you for down the road when you see another one like it.
No, absolutely. I mean, we know there's not one way to throw 100, which is pretty much everybody's goal these days. So it's super cool seeing, two completely different versions of the throw and how each guy kind of generates the force to get them to that 100-mile-an-hour throw.
Absolutely. So let's talk about, all right, so athlete rolls into CSP. Obviously, we go through health history, we go through their training experience. We have a sit down about what the goals are and stuff. And, one of our strength and conditioning coaches, slash physical therapist will take them through a thorough movement screen. And then we turn them over to the pitching crew. And obviously you want to see them as they are. The last thing you want to do is try to change things before you even know what you have on day one. But talk about what are the main things that you're looking at, when you're doing a motion capture report. What do you want to see?
So first, I mean, once we get the eval from the strength guys and the PT guys, we kind of get an idea of what it looks like before they get on motion capture, just so we're not surprised by any things. And then once we get on motion capture, we kind of start off with the kinematic sequencing. So we'll kind of hit on that a lot over the course of this, I'm sure. But so first thing we're going to look at is like how do they sequence? And I mean, those not familiar, sequencing is essentially how well you transfer energy. Starting from the ground up. So just to give like a brief overview of what we're looking for. So it'll give us this nice colorful graph with different segments of the body. It tracks our pelvis, our torso, elbow, shoulder, among other things. But for all intents and purposes, like kinematic sequencing is when and how fast you're moving certain parts of your body at what point in the throw. So we want to see people just get into the ground, start bearing weight on that lead leg. We want to see how fast and when they're moving through their pelvis. Then we want to see some spacing followed by the torso peaking in angular velocity, the elbow to extend, and the shoulder to peak in internal rotation velocity. So that's like kind of the first checkpoint we're looking for. Is the sequencing in the correct order? Is there good spacing? If something sticks out there, it will give us a good idea how to move forward. Going from there, we'll then work back and look at the positions. So the positions are going to determine how fast we move. And then how fast we move at certain times is going to determine the sequencing. So we'll backtrack, look at the positions. Is there something they're doing super early in the throw that's kind of leading to inconsistent or incorrect sequencing? And then kind of work from there and then check out the velocities. Is it something that we can fix? They're just poor rotators and we can get a really good, med ball program, chase some things in the gym from a strength perspective. But it all starts with sequencing, then we move to positions. And so the eval and everything we get on the strength side to start is huge. It's going to give us a really good idea of what the positions are going to look like. Sometimes we'll see guys get into some pretty extreme positions, especially for how they move and what they look like on the table. And that can kind of raise some red flags sometimes, or other times we'll see somebody who's got a ton of range of motion and not getting into great positions when they throw. And that will also give us a really good idea of how to move from there.
I think you just nailed it. Like you can't have a useful, insightful motion capture report unless you do it alongside a solid movement screen. Because you're really looking for a mismatch, right? Is this a hypermobile guy that doesn't use his range of motion to create velocity, or is it as stiff as a board guy that's chasing excessive range of motion? I mean, it obviously goes far beyond that, right?
Oh, 100%. I mean, it just takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. I mean, we know there are some positions that we want to get to in the throw. I mean, we love hip shoulder separation. We love a good scap load. We love an arm that lays back a ton, but we can't only look at these things in isolation. We have to kind of take in the whole picture. And if a guy can't get there, but he doesn't have the range of motion to get there, and we just ask him to chase it, chase it, chase it, we can definitely get into some trouble.
So, I mean, we'll jump right to the question that I think everybody always wants to know is what are your biggest indicators of, velocity? We should also talk about your indicators of, what we think keeps guys healthy. But let's talk about velo first.
Yeah, so velo, pretty much for 90% of the time, why everybody gets on motion capture is they want to throw harder, especially or some of our younger guys. So number one, we're going to look at good sequencing. Like I mentioned before, that's sequencing is kind of king. If we don't sequence well, it's going to probably be hard to generate good velocity, repeatable mechanics, which is probably not going to lead to repeatable command. So that's first and foremost. If the sequencing is really off, we got to figure out how to address that first. Some other markers that we have that really are indicative of velocity is pelvic rotation at weight bearing, what we call foot flat. So everybody has a little bit of a different measure on what they use for their foot flat measure. Some people are like first contact. Some people, once that foot get flat. And for us, it's when they start bearing weight on that lead leg. So we kind of go in there and mark that exact event point based on what we see and take some time, but it's definitely worth it in the long run. So pelvic rotation at weight bearing is a huge marker for us. I think it had an R value of almost 0.68 in our data set. It's super important. It's really rare that you find somebody who's super closed off through the hips when they get into the ground that throws really hard.
They
So
better have
that
electric arm speed, like just God-given ability.
100%. And part of the reason, and even those guys, I think it's sometimes our stiffer guys can get away with that because they can kind of blow through those positions and in tight windows. It doesn't take them as long to kind of work through that position. But for the most part, like, yeah, like you said, they got to have really good arm speed. But also, if we think about what the throw looks like, right? So we want to get into the ground, and we talked about sequencing, have our pelvis peak right after we get into the ground, some time for our torso to kind of come through and peak in rotational velocity, and then the elbow to extend, shoulder internally rotate. But if we're landing super close off to our pelvis, that means in order to create separation, we have to start way behind the line in terms of where our torso is. Our torso is probably going to almost be facing like shortstop. And we kind of want that hip to shoulder separation to kind of unravel in like a slingshot. And if we have to add rotation, a ton of rotation after we're already in the ground, it's kind of Ryan Conroy, one of our other pitching guys, actually came up with this analogy. It's like the difference between pulling a rubber band straight back and shooting it, or kind of pulling it around a pencil and shooting it, which is going to go further. The straight back, it's more of a true stretch and release of that separation. So that's a big
It's also
reason.
lower maintenance, right? Like it's less likely to hurt you. Our last podcast was about, stress fractures in the spine. Like they go and they chase motion in the wrong places. So it's just efficient deliveries, right?
100%. And right, we're trying to get everything super linear late. Like the delivery's a little bit linear getting down the mound, and then super rotational as we're getting into the ground. We rotate through the pelvis, we separate, rotate through the torso, but especially late, right? A block is knee extension, hip flexion. We have a ton of torso flexion. Our arm works ER, especially late like this. So we want to be super, super directional when we're after we get into the ground. So and then brings me to another marker is being at like close to 90 degrees through the pelvis and torso when we're at max layback. So guys who aren't there or can struggle with command, it's sometimes really tough to generate elite velocity. So those are just two really important things for us.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that we see a lot in young athletes, and maybe this is a good way to kind of relate some of these, for people who are listening, some of these like complex, positions to appreciate in an audio format is, we see a lot of guys that just chase early arm speed, right? I think often they're the kids who have just freakish, shoulder external rotation, and they're just like racing to like throw their torso towards the plate to try to find some stretch across the front of the shoulder, the inside of the elbow. These really, really loose guys, they're often the kids who have a Tommy John surgery and come back and have a shoulder or a thoracic outlet case. Like, how does this visually look to you when you do, motion capture report? When you see that guy that's, spraying balls up an arm side every time, like, where do you start when you're trying to evaluate, their ability to actually get a glove side fastball to go where it's supposed to, but also how to, safely and effectively, generate backspin on a four seam, like so that they have good velocity.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a direct answer to that because there's
Yeah.
a lot of reasons that we're spraying our fastballs arm
Yeah.
side high, whether it's the arm late, whether
Yeah.
we're not able to kind of get clear, as I mentioned earlier. But I think in each individual case, we kind of like start with the same groundwork. Like, what's the sequencing look like? Is it something that their pelvis is peaking after their torso and
Yeah.
rotational velocity? That'd be a huge red flag, right? That the pelvis got a lot of work to do late. We're probably landing super closed off, or is it something that the another marker in our sequencing is we want to see that elbow extend about, like, if we're imagining foot flat to ball releases is 100% of the throw for this for all intents and purposes here. We want to see that elbow extend at roughly 85% of that way. If their elbow is extending super early
Mhm.
and then they just kind of have to rip into shoulder internal rotation, we're going to see a lot of that arm side high miss. So each case is a little bit different, but kind of try to figure out what the low hanging fruit is and where to move from there.
That makes perfect sense. What are some of the common misconceptions that we see when folks are using or analyzing motion capture?
So I think I kind of touched on a little bit earlier. We know there are things that help us throw hard, laying our arm back more, creating more separation, getting deeper in our scap, rotating faster. But I think the biggest problem is when we start chasing these things in isolation, right? So like, well, I'll do a motion capture report, kind of going over with the athlete, and the only thing they'll see is like, holy cow, I scored in the 20th percentile of scap load. And all of a sudden they're just start, chasing scap load, shoving their scap back, trying to find space there. And so I think when we start chasing those things in isolation and not kind of patterning better movements to help them get into better positions, I think we see some problems there. So I think that, like, obviously it's baseball, nothing happens in a vacuum. So just because we get into a better position, if it's not happening at the right time, if it's not a little bit more organic, then we're probably not going to reap the benefits of it. And actually, super interesting, the top two guys in our data set in hip to shoulder separation were nowhere near the top of our velocity leaders. So it's just some interesting stuff. We know those are things that help us throw hard, but we cannot chase them in isolation.
It's like trying to do I always use the analogy of like a sumo deadlift, right?
Yeah.
You find yourself like a 1.5 times your hip width stance. Like you can put force into the ground. Like you could do a vertical jump from that position. But if you bring your feet out wider and wider and wider, you can't possibly put force into the ground. You're effectively too overstretched to actually safely and effectively produce force. So I think the delivery for a lot of athletes that chase those big positions, it becomes the exact same thing. You're not in a position to be athletic.
Yeah,
You know,
sometimes it just kind of makes the problem even worse. So if it's
yeah.
like arms late because we're super closed off and we just chase more separation, we're just going to be even further behind the line.
Yeah, and my next question, I think you kind of already answered it. I'm going to read it anyway because I think it's good to like conceptually wrap our head around it, maybe even to reiterate is, I had written down how important is good kinematic sequencing and what does that mean? I think you talked about how important it was, but I'm not sure folks necessarily appreciate what the terminology actually means in the grand scheme of things. Maybe clarify that for folks.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think we've all heard it at some point or another, but like, oh, he sequences super well. And so I think with motion capture over the past, 5, 10 years, or however long it's been around, it's actually given us a way to quantify it and qualify it. So what good sequencing is each segment of your body peaking at the right time in either rotational velocity or in elbow extension velocity for the elbow's case. So we really need to see these things happening. If we're trying to transfer energy from the ground up, we need to see them in a certain order, and we need to see them happening with good spacing as well. So just because we have the right order doesn't mean it's going to be great if it's pelvis torso peaking right on top of each other. We need to see good spacing as well to allow that energy to transfer up. If we're It's the two biggest ones, especially in the upper half. I think when we see poor upper half sequencing, we're in a lot of trouble. Some guys can, like as you mentioned, elite arm speed, just really good compensators. I think guys who have a little bit more of a lower half sequencing problem can get away with it.
Mhm.
But if we have upper half sequencing problems, it's going to be very, very hard to, one, throw hard, be repeatable, command the baseball, and stay healthy.
We interrupt this podcast with a quick reminder that this episode is brought to you by AG1. It's an NSF certified all-in-one superfood supplement that features 75 whole food sourced ingredients designed to support your body's nutritional needs. I use this product daily myself, and a ton of our athletes do as well. Head to drinkag1.com/Cressey and claim my special offer of 10 free travel packets with your first purchase. AG1 gives you peace of mind that you're covering all your nutritional bases. Again, that's drinkag1.com/Cressey, Cressey, and you'll get that special offer.
No doubt. What are some of the typical trends we see regarding arm speed and, how do we use the measures that we get relative to programming, right? Because we've all seen the guy who shows up on a motion capture, scap load isn't good, so they're doing a bunch of like aggressive scap retraction stuff. They actually get worse. They get exponentially worse because it becomes a very segmented mechanical delivery. Like how do you take what you see on the motion capture and actually, carry it over to the drill work you prescribe?
Yeah, so arm speed is a super interesting one to me because I feel like we all think if my arm moves fast, I'm going to throw hard. And a lot of the time that is true, but sometimes is it moving fast at the right times? Is it moving fast because the positions we put the rest of our body in are pretty poor? And then then the last part to it is I think that it is a really good indicator of how to move forward. So we're huge fans of weighted ball programs here, but in the right situation. If somebody's already got electric arm speed and they want to throw harder, and we get them on motion capture and we see elite arm speed, it's like how much more can we get there? They're already elite in the arm speed category. If we just throw an underweight ball in their hand and start ripping it, we're probably just adding fuel to the fire and probably not going to get the outcome desired. So, but if we see somebody with like a really, or longer levers, really good sequencing, gets to awesome positions, the velocities in the 92, 93 range, and we're looking for more, it's like, hey, he does everything else pretty well. I think chasing a little arm speed has a ton of merit here.
I think, there's a default logic, and maybe logic's a terrible word for this, like across the industry is just chase arm speed with throwing programs. And in many cases, like there's much lower hanging fruit. Like there's research that shows that just gaining weight and strength works. Throwing med balls works. Sleeping better works. Like obviously sequencing is probably the lowest hanging fruit of them all. Is like don't chase a program to improve arm speed until you understand how your pelvis, your thorax, everything is actually working together. Where do you start? So when's the best time to use motion capture throughout the year? And also, is there a minimum threshold age where you actually consider this? Because we both know, like, taking an 11-year-old kid who's prepubescent, doesn't have any strength, like, it's not going to tell you anything that you don't necessarily already know.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think I would love to say use it anytime,
Yep.
because the more information we can get on it, the better. Unfortunately, we don't always have access to it. It depends on the level, the situation. So I would say for our pro guys, I mean, I think the best case scenario is we get them in after the season. We get them on motion capture before they shut it down for the beginning of their off season, take their vacation, recoup and everything. So two reasons I love when they get on it at the end of the season is one, if they're feeling fantastic, we can capture that and have objective numbers that really tell us where they're at when they're feeling fantastic, throwing hard, commanding the ball, their shapes are good. Or two, let's say they struggled down the stretch, things weren't great. We get them on mocap. We create a really good plan for the off season. It will give us an idea what to do from a throwing perspective, from the strength perspective, and then they can take their time off. When they hop back in the gym, we can have a really good plan for how to move forward for the 3.5 months we'll have them for. So that's for our pro guys. I love that situation. For the younger guys, it can be a little bit different, especially down here in Florida where we really don't stop playing baseball year round. But kind of, I think for the younger guys, I think, I would love for more time off from those guys here and shut it down for the fall and just kind of ramp back up for the spring season. I think a really good opportunity for them would be, in between spring and summer ball. I think wins are a little bit more important in spring in as terms of how high school goes. So it gives us some time, if we can work on things in game to try to see the results, we don't have to really worry about the wins and losses as much. But I would say as much as we can get guys on motion capture, I'm happy. So
Yeah, it goes a long way. And I think it is, I mean, I think we've seen the aha moments. Like it's hard for me in a weight room to be like, hey, do this mobility exercise and we're going to see 4 more miles per hour. Like there have absolutely been like kind of the blow your mind moments where, a kid gets on there and just conceptually it makes sense. And the next time they go out and throw a pen and they're averaging, 4 or 5 miles an hour harder and doing it effortlessly just because sequencing can be that dramatic a shift for certain people. What are some other paths from a developmental standpoint that maybe this technology takes you to? Like we always talked about driving weight room programs, mobility warm-ups, impacting the throw programs. Like I'm sure there are scenarios where it's told you like, hey, this guy moves better heavier or moves better lighter. Like where has your brain gone after you've gotten the results of some of these motion capture events?
I think it's been awesome for our distance guys as well. Guys, we can't, get hands-on coaching every day. We kind of have to rely on a little bit of tag with video, phone calls, stuff like that, hopping on Zoom when we can. So obviously we won't have the numbers of them from motion capture, but I think we've gotten to the point where it's like, you can see a delivery. What's
Yeah.
looking wrong with the delivery? We won't have as clear a picture as we do when we get them on motion capture. But hey, we look at the picture. So I hate keep going back to this example, but their pelvis is super closed off, right? Like we had 5 guys we got on motion capture this summer with the same thing. We saw awesome results. This was the throwing progression. We put them through. These were the med balls we had them throw. These were the exercises we did in the weight room. So it kind of gives us like a little bit of a pathway archetype on how to kind of address these situations from afar, which, sometimes in the past, it's like, hey, try this, try this, try this, kind of throwing stuff at a wall and hoping it sticks. But just had a ton of success, like kind of visualizing what's wrong with the delivery and kind of implementing some of these progressions we've had based on what the situation is.
Absolutely. Maybe talk about you hinted at already, but the biggest success stories, like what are some places where a subtle sequencing adjustment driven by, throwing on Thea, getting some markerless motion capture, what happened and how were issues addressed?
Yeah, so I'm gonna use one specific one that kind of jumps off the page at me, and it was super exciting to watch and experience this past summer. So we had a college kid who got on mocap when he first got here at the beginning of the summer. He was 86 miles an hour, and he was hawking it. Hat was flying off, so we can't say it's a light 80% touch. I mean, he was sending it. So we analyzed the data. We took a look at what was wrong. The sequencing was pretty poor, and the pelvis was peaking super late. And part of the reason the pelvis was peaking super late is because when he was bearing weight on that lead leg, he was at 11 degrees of pelvic rotation. So essentially, his pelvis was facing third base, and it's going to make it really hard to throw harder than 86, even though he did have pretty electric arm speed. So then on top of the pelvis being at 11 degrees, when he was laying his arm back, his torso and his pelvis were at 67 degrees. And if you can imagine, home plate is 90 degrees. If we're trying to throw a ball towards home plate and we're only 2/3 of the way there, by the time we're at max layback, we're probably going to struggle a little bit to generate some velocity and command the baseball. So for him, I mean, this is why again, we have this indicator pelvis rotation at weight bearing. He scored about as low as we could here. And so we worked on for about 5.5, 6 weeks on clearing his pelvis, getting more rotated through our lower half into the ground. We have a really good throwing progression for that, a lot of forward facing throws. We even cued him a few times to like playing catch on a line. Hey, you got to land on the other side of this line, like almost force him to gate a little bit to open that pelvis up. And then we just kind of saw him start getting put together like he was 86 mocap day. A couple weeks later, we got on the mound. It was like 88, touching some 89s in a bullpen. Then we had one day. It was awesome. First throw was 90. I was like, oh, it's going to be a great day. Up to 92 that day. And his last pen before he got out of here was actually, he was up to 94.7. Not going to give him 95, but he was up to 94.7. So we gained roughly 9 miles an hour over 6 weeks. And that was like the biggest focus we had. And we've seen a ton of other kind of similar situations like that. So that's probably by far the biggest success story, considering it was only 6 weeks and we made a lot of progress.
Well, I think the other thing too is you're allowed to get in more quality work when you get to better positions. Like the outrageous soreness that you feel from trying to do too much kind of dissipates. Like I always think back to the example a couple of years ago, and I don't even know if it was like truly driven by data more than it was eyes. Is just like looking at a guy, crazy hypermobile athlete who just got into extreme positions of dorsiflexion, and it impacted everything that was downstream. Is you literally can't get he was a left-handed pitcher, so he was literally drifting towards first base a ton, and he couldn't get his pelvis open. And I remember threw him in a pair of high top cleats, and it changed his life. It just made him a little bit more linear and allowed him to get his pelvis open, and everything got better and better. So like sometimes it's drills, sometimes it's like an external implement like that can help you to get on a good path. But the sky's the limit. I always think we have a pro pitcher in our data set, and he's got some of the most limited shoulder ER in the data set. Doesn't have an electric arm. It's not one of those arms that like wants to knock you over, but he's a guy who's throwing 100. You know what I'm talking about? Like, talk about how he does it. Like, why doesn't all that stuff line up, yet he's still able to throw 100 miles an hour?
Yeah, so I mean, we talk about not elite arm speed, but he's still got enough arm speed.
Yeah.
The biggest things for him is like the sequencing. We keep hammering it home, but like obviously it's something that plays a very important role in velocity generation. So he's an elite sequencer. He gets to awesome positions. He's got really long levers, which helps.
Tight window.
Yeah, tight. He rotates very fast in a tight window. The positions just aren't extreme that we want to traditionally see in a motion capture report. And actually, interesting enough, like two of our guys who've been up to 100 are kind of lower in terms of max ER in our data set. We got like two guys who throw 100 is they don't even crack the top half, I think, which is super, super interesting.
Everyone thinks you need to chase it, but there's a lot of different ways to be elite. Besides the in-lab mocap, which we're bringing indoors as soon as this big renovation is done, so folks can follow along social media in case we ever complete it. But how else have we seen motion capture used, and what are some other benefits you see for it? I know you've nerded out with some of our PGA golfers a little bit, and you have some big plans on that front. I'm going to get our tennis boys in too, but what else have you looked at, and what makes you excited about it?
I think that baseball's come so far in the last 10 years. We went from, just learning what a wrap soda was, and then we got TrackMan, and now we have Hawkeye, which is Hawkeye's a pretty cool thing to have in the stadiums. And it gives us the opportunity to actually get in-game biomech data from these guys. I think it does a number of things for them, like one, injury prevention, two, mechanical interventions, and like also modeling and projections. I'll start with the first one, injury projection. Like we get all these in-game biomech reports and we can kind of see these trends. And so, hey, like elbow extension or elbow starts peaking earlier, and extension, we can kind of see that trend going on and maybe put the brakes on that before, we see somebody get hurt. Two, mechanical interventions, right? We can have exact data when they were throwing 100, and let's say they come out the next outing and it's 96, and be like, hey, what's the difference? Your stride was 105% your height when you were throwing 100, and it was only 96% your height when you're throwing 96. So those are two really big things. And then I think also the modeling and the projections is huge as well. So we get to, we've built everything off our in-lab mocap data, but this is not always these guys at game speed. Some guys that throw 100 can't even break 95 10. So we're getting some good data, but we're not getting the, hey, I got to punch this guy out or my life depends on it fastball. So I think it's incredible for all those things. And like, it's just going to only help the game grow.
Absolutely. We use Thea. Talking about, what's unique about Thea, and how does it compare to other motion capture systems that are out there?
Yeah, so I think this is something that's super important to kind of recognize when we're using motion capture in general is the numbers. What I've seen are a little bit different system to system, what ranges you're kind of working through. So like our max external rotation is seems to be a little bit toned down compared to other things I've seen. But like the ranges are all the same. So I think it's super important to kind of make sure you have your data set and work with what's in your range and not try to compare it to other things. Same as goes for anything. But yeah, I've seen like our data sets kind of toned down in these huge positions. Also the timing and the tracking of the foot flat, as we mentioned earlier. Some systems are like, foot contact, some are foot flat. Ours is weight bearing. If you can add force plate mounts to it, you'll know exactly when that foot is actually bearing the full weight. So I think those are some of the differences, but just always important to keep in mind, like, what are the parameters of your system?
I love that. So we always on the tail end, we wrap up with some lightning round, and I'm gonna blend the normal questions into the lightning round. I'm curious how motion capture would have helped you as a college pitcher. First describe yourself, and you were a CSP client, so and I know you still get a pretty darn good arm, although your golf game's probably taken over better now. When you look back on your own playing career, like how would this have favorably impacted you?
I think not only this, but anything I would have learned here. I was self-proclaimed internet pitching coach. I thought I had all the answers and knew how to get myself to throw harder. And I remember there was one point I started, trying to get to throw like Jacob deGrom, and I started looking more and more like Jacob deGrom, but my velocity started trending the wrong direction. And I just really, I was like, if it looks better, it's going to probably come out better. And as we've learned, and with access to things like motion capture, we know that's not always the case. So to me, it's just like, it's give me a whole complete new view on how pitching works, how velocity is generated, how command can be impacted by all these things, like what it actually matters and how it it is very, very, very important to individualize and make sure we're looking at it holistically and not just be like, hey, I need more of this, I need more of that, but like, what are my capabilities? What kind of archetype am I? We talk about it infrasternal angle. We talk about loose versus stiff movers. We talk about guys who are long levered, short levered. So all this stuff is super important. And when we look at and watch guys in TV, it's like we seem to always chase the outliers, and it's and as we try to always copy the outliers, and it's like, there's a lot of other guys who kind of probably a little bit more similar to you. Like, I'm not the biggest individual in the world, and me trying to chase the same way to throw hard as guys who are 6'4", 6'5" is probably not going to result in good news for me.
Right on. Next, what's the next frontier in motion capture? Like, I know you're a voracious reader. You're always coming to ideas. I know you do your own modeling and stuff like that for players and contracts and things like that. But what excites you the most about like where baseball could go? What information is it that you'd love to have?
I think there's a few things here. I think that one, I believe it's in the works already. I think you mentioned it to me before, but I think of baseball that you can kind of understand somebody's force applications and force preferences, and it will give you a really good idea of what their pitch grips should look like to kind of create certain shapes. I think that hard to do now because it is dirt, but I think at some point they'll figure out a way how to put force plates in actual game mounds. I would not be surprised if we see that eventually. But I just think as we learn more, have access to more information, I mean, we see how much better we're able to make everybody, give people who like originally probably didn't have a chance to play at the level they desired, a chance to play at that level. And a lot of guys, they'll come in 88, 87, 88, which is, borderline, and we can spend some good work in them on motion capture, use all the other tools at our hands, and kind of give them the chance to play professional baseball.
I love it. Last question. So we roll out our CSP Pro experience. It's a 10-week college summer program that runs from June to August down at our Florida facility, and you're coming up on your third round of it. So I know you can speak to it. Maybe describe this program, how motion capture fits in, and maybe some of the results that we've had in it.
Yeah. So first of all, I just want to kind of backtrack and start from the beginning. And I think that this program has done wonders for a lot of the guys in it, and not I think we've done an okay job, but I think more so for the fact that like these guys go and they throw 60 innings in the spring, and then they want to go throw another 40 in summer ball. And I think like depending on your situation, if it's something that like, hey, I'm about to go get drafted, I need to go throw in the Cape, that's definitely something that's acceptable. But I think like, just to go get 60 innings in another league doesn't make a ton of sense. And so like a lot of the guys we've had a ton of success with is the guys we've actually been able to spend that time with developments. We got a 10-week program. We kind of, take some time off after the season finishes up. We'll ramp them back up real quick, like in a safe manner, don't worry. But ramp them back up. Like we'll get them on motion capture right away. So we have a really good plan on what the rest of the summer is going to look like. We know how to attack that from a strength standpoint, a throwing standpoint. They have nutrition consults, weekly manual therapy. Then we get them on, like we create goals, and then we get them on motion capture halfway through. Did we get closer to our goals? Are we moving in the right direction? Are we way further than where we started? And then we kind of understand how to move from there. And then they get an exit motion capture to kind of see if we achieved our goals and give them some things to take with them to the fall for their season. So it's been unbelievable. We've seen a ton of velocity jumps, a ton of command improvements just based on getting stronger, getting more repeatable, and not just going out there and throwing 6 innings every 6th day just because.
It's an opportunity to do some pitch design stuff. We obviously use force plates, Proteus, a lot of tech just to evaluate progress, and just as importantly, basically make sure that programs are tailored to individuals. So if folks are interested in that, best bet is just email cspflorida@gmail.com. That's the best way to inquire, get more information about it. It's also an avenue for getting in touch with Nate or I if you have questions about motion capture or all things CSP pitching, distance-based programming, all that fun stuff. Folks can find Nate. You're on both Twitter and social media, or excuse me, and Instagram. Instagram it's NatheMirochnick, and then on Twitter it's NMirochnick. Nate, this was terrific. Thanks for taking the time, buddy.
Thanks for having me. This was a blast.
Absolutely.